Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly discussion series that's hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with U of M Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. I'm your host, Wiam Nemu, and today our guest is Dr. Monica Eraqi. Hello. Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you for joining us. So you are our last guest that's celebrating Arab American Heritage Month this month, which is also happens to be Chaldean American Month. So we're very glad to have you. So Dr. Eraqi is an 18-year high school social studies teacher in the Chippewa Valley Schools. A national board certified teacher, she currently teaches U.S. history, economics, and modern Middle East, a course that she exclusively designed and implemented 16 years ago. She has served as an assistant professor teaching multicultural education at the graduate level. She holds a doctorate from the University of Michigan in curriculum and instruction. Her research and publications are concentrated on multicultural education with a specific focus on Arab American and Muslim American studies at the secondary social studies level. Wow. Well, your position is very highly needed right now with all the things that are going on, right? So before we get into all these topics, though, tell us a little bit about your background, where you were born, and what it was like growing up as an Arab American.
So actually, I was born here in Michigan, in Warren, Michigan, and my parents are both immigrants. My dad immigrated from Egypt. My mom immigrated from a small Eastern European country known as Slovakia, which at the time was part of the larger Czechoslovakia. So my upbringing was really unique because both of my parents were coming from different countries, from different backgrounds and different cultures, different continents, and then met in Detroit and ended up getting married and starting a family here. So I grew up in a home that was very multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious. So that was part of our upbringing. And because both of my parents were the only ones who immigrated from their families, we really were almost on an island. I didn't have relatives, extended family members, aunts, uncles, cousins that were here. So going back to my parents' countries, home countries, was a really important part of our upbringing. So we spent almost every summer going back to Slovakia, going back to Egypt, and spending the summers there with our relatives. And that was a really cool experience for us to be able to have. That was really where I got to see my parents' childhood homes. I got to spend time with my family to really be immersed in each of their cultures and each of the things that they grew up with. And there are a lot of happy memories and some painful memories, but that really was the first major exposure to our culture that I had. And so those summers are always very cherished memories for me.
So I gotta ask you, your last name, Iraqi, is
Mhm.
it Iraqi? I mean, that's what it
Yes.
sounds like. What's the origin of your
Yes.
name?
So our last name is Eraqi, but our family origin is actually Egyptian. So my dad was born and raised in Egypt, but the last name and how we get the last name is still something that I've been trying to research through our family genealogy, which is not easy to do in the Middle East, but it's something that I've been looking to kind of get a better understanding of.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. I love these kind of things to see like what are our backgrounds and what roots, what do you have to do with Iraq that it's somehow part of your name. So that's interesting.
Exactly.
Um, how did you get involved in social study as a social studies teacher? What led you to that profession?
I think my parents had a large part of that, really. And I don't even think they realized the role that they played in really developing this passion for social studies for me. Traveling as often and as frequently as we did, just out of necessity to be able to visit our family, was really a strong part of that. Going back and looking at my parents being able to retell the history that they lived through, the uh, examples that they were able to give me, that was really a big part of it. And then when I came back to the States and was going to school here during the normal school year, that's when these topics would be brought up in our social studies classes. And I really was excited to be able to share what my family had experienced, what my parents had experienced, that the fact that I got to go there and see these things firsthand, whether it was talking about being at the pyramids and seeing the pyramids and talking about them, or my mom's experiences in Eastern Europe trying to break away from communism. All of these things were really important that I felt now for the first time in the curriculum, I got to contribute to it. And so I think that really built up that passion for history and social studies for me.
So did they easily share their stories? I know, like in my case, my dad was more interested in sharing the stories. My mom, I think later I learned when I was older that there was she'd undergone too much trauma, and there was so she really didn't like to share stories, and everything was like, oh, let's just forget about that. And I had to get her stories oftentimes from someone else because I could see her resistance.
Yeah.
How were your parents? I know that you're in the school, right? So right now, the is that the bell going
Mhm.
on?
Yeah, school to start.
Yeah, you're a hard worker. So were they both the kind that shared these stories willingly? And also, did you had they both experienced hardship from the periods that they came from, like the time frame that
For
they
sure, some
were
stories are
in?
easier for them to tell than other stories. What I think when we would go back and we were actually standing in the same spot where some of these events took place, I think that would make them relive it, and that could sometimes make it more painful. But in other instances, I feel like them telling the story was very therapeutic for them. It helped them to cope with it, and it helped them to heal from some of the things that they experienced. And I think they were really proud to be able to stand at some of these spots with me and be able to share these things. We would go to cemeteries and visit deceased family members and loved ones. And that's not something that everybody can do, is to be able to go to the cemetery and pray at the graves of your ancestors. So even though it was painful and difficult to do, the fact that we could do it, I think was a really important factor in some of those things. And so maybe they didn't feel as comfortable all the time, but they definitely did their best to try to explain the circumstances that they had experienced. And so I think for them, sometimes it was a healing factor.
Yeah, I totally believe in that. I feel that some of the things I was born in Baghdad, and that some of the trauma that I went through, that it was through storytelling that I was able to get past that to the point where I can share a story and not feel as there's some detachment that I realized it happened. I looked at it, I acknowledged it. It doesn't mean that it exists today, that it doesn't have to be a part of my everyday life. And I know that this is something very, very important for most people, but especially for Middle Easterners, because they have gone through quite a bit from the region. There's so many wars and things like that going on. And I was wondering, what inspired you to design and implement the Modern Middle East course? And what impacts has it had so far on your students?
The first time I actually was able to take a Middle Eastern course wasn't until I was in college. And so it was when I got into my freshman year of college and I had an elective called the Modern Middle East, and I took that course. It was so eye opening for me. This was something where I had a chance to see the stories that my dad had been telling me since I was a little kid. And now my professors were standing in front of me and telling me these same stories and verifying and confirming the stories that my dad had told me. It also showed me how important the Middle East was, how important and influential the Middle East was, something that I didn't see in the traditional public school curriculum, which was very Eurocentric. And we also have to be careful when we use this term Eurocentric, because my mom is from Europe, but even then, it's a very Western European centric curriculum that we see happening in public schools. I mean, we barely talked about Eastern Europe or even my mom's country. So it was really important that when I got to college and I had a chance to see this, that I gained a better appreciation for it. But at the same time, I also felt cheated. Why was it now, as somebody who is 18 years old, why am I just now learning about the history of my ancestry? Why wasn't I learning about it before? So that was one of the things that I was learning about the Renaissance, and I was learning about Italy and Spain and France and Great Britain and Germany, but I wasn't learning about the importance of the Middle East. And so that's what really made me very hungry. I wanted to know more. So from one course, I kept taking courses. I eventually went to the American University in Cairo and took more courses while I was in Egypt and came back. And this led to a whole evolution for me of really trying to dig into my culture, dig into Middle Eastern history, learn more about it. That while this event was happening in Europe, what was happening in the Middle East? While this was happening in America, what was going on in the Middle East, to really get a more clear perspective of my own ancestry. And then I thought, wow, this would have been great if I would have had this when I was in high school. when I was a student. And so when I became a teacher, that was a really profound moment for me to be able to say, I want my students to be able to see this. But I think the biggest factor was that, when I started, when I was a public school student, this was all pre 9/11. And then I became a teacher post 9/11. So when I entered the classroom, I found that even my students had a lot of questions about the Middle East, about what was going on in the Middle East. And they didn't know how to ask these questions. And so thankfully I was able to develop enough of a connection to the students that they felt comfortable to approach me and ask me these questions. And that's when I thought, these kids have questions and they want to know more. We need to have a course. And so that's what really led to the development of it, of creating a course that would allow them to be able to answer these questions that they had. What is America's role in the Middle East? What is happening in the Middle East currently? So it went from focusing on the events of 9/11 and after to now being a more current events course about the Middle East.
As I listen to this, I can't help but smile to the similarities that, yesterday I did a presentation for Ford. And a lady asked me a very nice question at the end. She said, what similarities would you say that the Chaldeans have with the Arabs? Because as we know, there are sometimes tensions, there's some identity issues that people want to identify as Chaldeans, oftentimes because they could not express that from where they came from. But everything you just now expressed has been also, it's so similar to what we went through when we discovered, like, oh, what is it to be Chaldean? I'm just coming across this now. And aside from the religious aspect, what is it really to be Chaldean? So I'm going to add this into one of the similarities, okay, Monica, because I gave her other similarities like the food, the language, the music, a lot of many, many beautiful things that we do have in common. But now on a deeper level, I think the immigration experience, we might have left for different reasons in some cases, but everything that you just described, it seems like we got to know who we are when we got older and when we started seeing that our stories were missing from educational institutions, from places, and we started digging and wanting to know and to see how can we use our position and our role to educate people. I know, like, a lot of young people also, for me, they say, we want to find out more. And in our case, I think we're still kind of digging for that research, whereas the Arab American community and the Muslim community has a lot more information out there. But at the end of the day, there's that same sense that you want to connect and you want to know. So it's really commendable work. And it's just, but the similarities, I just love that. The more we speak, the more we communicate, the more we find how similar we have. And also, I think the differences are unique as well. I mean, we're all different, even as Chaldeans or Arab Americans, we all have different points of views, different political views. That's another thing. Sometimes people think because you're Chaldean, you fit into that category. And if you're an Arab, you fit into that category. And that's not necessarily true either.
Right. Yeah. That's a big part of having the course. And that was one of the key reasons for why I called it the Modern Middle East course, because I wanted to make sure that I was including all Middle Eastern students. I didn't call it an Arab American course. It was really meant to focus on all of the different backgrounds that exist in the Middle East and to really try to shift that single story narrative that people have of the Middle East. So I wanted them to see how diverse the Middle East is, how many different ethnic and religious groups that we have in the Middle East, the number of languages, how different the cuisine is, and the clothing and the culture. I wanted them to see that the Middle East is a very, very unique, very beautiful place, but they weren't seeing that because they just weren't being exposed to it. And so that was a strong part of that.
So I think this answers part of the next question I was going to ask you, is that, what are some of the key findings or themes that you have that has emerged from your work? Do you find that that's part of it, is bringing awareness to the diversity of the Middle East? And what are some of the other factors as well?
For sure, I noticed a lot throughout my research. I did different layers of research in terms of analyzing the actual social studies curriculum at the secondary level. I did a nationwide survey of social studies teachers, and I actually analyzed textbooks by the 5 major textbook publishing companies to really look at when are Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterners mentioned or included. And what was really disheartening to find was that it was usually only during times of conflict or violence. So we would find the Middle East being mentioned during the Crusades, during the 1970s oil embargo, the Iran hostage crisis, Persian Gulf, 9/11. These were really the only times that we saw the Middle East being included in the curriculum. And so, of course, if you are a student going through the K through 12 curriculum through public education, this leaves you with a very bitter taste that the only time you're being exposed to the Middle East is in connection with violence or with conflict. And that's definitely not been our history within the Middle East. There have been so many major accomplishments, so many positive contributions, not just in the Middle East, but by Middle Eastern Americans in the United States. And students were not getting that either in the curriculum or they weren't getting it in textbooks. And it only added to what they were seeing in the media, which was, again, a continuation of this single story narrative. So that was the first really disheartening sign of things that I noticed through the research. But that was a key aspect, I would say, that really helps to push.
I want to add on to something about that because, again, yesterday when I was giving the presentation, I brought up, we were talking about this, and I felt that there's such a beautiful side to the Arab world, to the Middle East, and there's so much diversity. And I think part of what is going on as well is partly our fault, to be honest with you. And I'm talking just from Middle Easterners in general, and that we don't give enough value to storytelling. We don't nurture that. So what you are doing and what you're trying to bring the light on, and how you just even talked about the healing that happens when you share stories. I don't think we do enough of a good job doing that. We have an amazing, when I was doing the feature film Pomegranate, we had an amazing list of talented people that we couldn't choose from. We were like, oh my God, where did all these people come from? Because I have not seen them really anywhere the way they deserve to be seen. And I know that that has been my experience as well, that there's a lack of support in that area, but it's an important part because this is where when we would have the opportunity to showcase our stories, there's hardly any room in there because the other stories are taking over. So I think from my perspective, just looking within, is that we could do a better job with that if the opportunity comes up.
Oh yeah, and definitely those opportunities do appear for us in the curriculum.
Yeah, and now that we're talking about the media and all these things happening right now, I wanted to get what is your perspective with regards to the protests that are happening in the colleges, and what is your perspective on that, and what advice would you give students that are involved in it, given your expertise and your wisdom in the Middle Eastern community?
What we have, seen time and time again, as somebody who's a history teacher, is that we see students being on the forefront of these major events that are taking place internationally. Students are pushing and wanting more information. They want to know more about boycott, divest, and sanction. They want to know more about how money is being spent. They want to know and be more involved in these types of events. And so they're really working hard to educate themselves, but also to educate other Americans. And so I think that is a huge part, but that's been the history of American education. Honestly, we have seen students again and again being at the forefront of making these changes. And we've seen the classroom be a battleground for a lot of these things that are taking place. So the protests that we see happening across college campuses, this is not a new phenomenon for the United States. We saw protests happening on college campuses when it came to the Vietnam War. We saw discussions about whether schools should segregate or integrate happening in the 1950s and into the 60s. We saw questions about whether or not schools should teach about Darwinism and science versus creationism. So the classroom has always been a key place where we've had these major discussions. And so I think what we're seeing right now is that the students, again, are at the forefront of this, really trying to make some key changes. Excuse me for just 1 second. to some of the things that we see happening, and um, and they've definitely shown passion and shown research in what they've been trying to do. So um, they're following a long American tradition that we've seen happening again on college campuses and universities.
But there are in some cases where the Jewish community feels like they're under attack because of the way things are happening. And I gotta tell you about something that happened last week that was just very inspiring and very meaningful for us as in our community. So the Iraqi Prime Minister came to the Chaldean Cultural Center, and he walked through the museum, and I met him. Wonderful man, very humble, and he gave a beautiful speech that recognized what had taken place in Iraq, given that Iraq Chaldeans as an indigenous people, given their long history of their faith, and given the genocide that had taken place over there, actually over the years, but he was focused on the 2014 genocide. And, it was very inspiring that he wants to start something positive and that he wants to work with all the communities, which by the time he left, once these words come out of somebody, once you feel that you've been seen for what has happened, they're automatically your guard comes down and you want to listen more. And actually you want to embrace that person and say, yeah, you know what, I want to work with you because you've acknowledged some things that seem like they are, that they are hidden under the rug, swept under the rug. So is there a way that we can find to touch the other community as well? So it's not like us versus them versus us, because that happened a lot from where I came from. And again, that one speech that he gave dispelled that tension, dispelled some of the feelings that sometimes you don't even realize that you have. We have resistance. There's a lot of people that have their weapons up. I'm not talking physical weapons, even on a mental scale. Like we just have this, we've gone through so much. Yeah. So I was, what is it? How can we change it to improve upon it? So I do believe that there is, I'm total believer of freedom of speech, by the way. I mean, given where I come from, we were punished for if we didn't express the right views or actually for speaking up about anything. So I'm totally, and as a writer, so I'm totally for free speech and everything like that. But at the same time, I'm always also interested to learn and see. And I love our community. I mean, my stories focus on the Chaldean Iraqi American experience. And I work with Arabs regularly and they're my friends. And this is just something we care about each other. Obviously we care. The Muslim community had joined us. It was just a beautiful scene. Like at the event, they were our bishop was sitting with with the imams, and it was just such a beautiful sight and sound what we were hearing. How can we improve upon some of the things that are happening so that there's more of people not feeling like one is against the other?
Well, I think this really is the protests that we see that are happening are really not just being led by Arab or Muslim students or even American students that we see being a part of this. Some of the other communities have been incredibly strong voices in this. Other communities that have experienced genocide. We see the Jewish community really coming out in large numbers and exposing themselves to be out there at support at these universities and protests worldwide to support Palestinians and to really call out Israel for its acts of genocide that we see happening in Gaza. So the Jewish community has come out in large numbers and really worked together as a coalition with other communities to be able to raise awareness to what's happening. We see the Christian community coming out in big numbers. This is a multifaceted, it's not just isolated to one ethnic group or one religious group. We see other communities who've been exposed to genocide or have experienced genocide, who, whether it was because of their ethnicity or their religious background, all now coming together because they understand that this is now a major event that they want to be a part of to promote awareness about Palestine or to prevent the genocide that's taking place, whatever action. But sitting by idly, they have a hard time doing. So I think we've already seen on many levels, Jewish and Christian, Muslim, whether they're Arab or whether they are multiracial, are coming together to be able to support what we're seeing, whether it's the student protests or any of the protests that we've seen taking place across the nation. They've been out there blocking ships that are sending weapons to Israel. They've been out there protesting at Congress. They have shut down subway systems in New York. They've all been working together very actively. So I think there's already a strong coalition that we've seen.
Yeah, and I agree. Like for us, because of the war in Iraq, which cost all, it was such a senseless war. Everybody at this point agrees on that. So of course we're totally against war and all the damage that that does. I think what the other community might feel is that like the sense of not wanting to in any kind of way kind of look at October 7th. And to me, from what they have shared with us, this is the area is wondering why can't like we both feel something for both incident where we don't want terrorism and we don't want war, which is just both are. I don't know why I don't have my foot off this today, which are both just harmful for society in general. I think this is might be the area where they feel a little bit unheard or unseen.
And it's a really strange phenomenon because when, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, if people talk about Russia today, nobody says, well, you're being anti-Ukrainian. You know what I mean? So we see this. This is a different field or a different scope that we've noticed happening when it comes to the Palestinian issue that we didn't necessarily notice 2 years ago when we were talking about Ukraine. So I know that there'll definitely be sensitivity on both sides, but it's in recognizing that when you're analyzing the Palestinian situation, this is a situation that's been going on for 70 years. Nobody is saying that Hamas is correct, that what happened on October the 7th is correct. That's not what this is about. This is about ending the slaughter that we see happening in Gaza. This is a humanitarian issue, that we are against the killing and slaughtering of children. We are against and opposed to genocide. That is a clear stance as a humanitarian issue.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to talk about some of your other work, including that. So you've developed lessons for the Arab American National Museum and Georgetown University. When you develop these lessons, what do you put into consideration? And is like right now with what that's happening, does that change what you're creating, or are those two separate things? How do you make those decisions?
The first thing that has to come to mind is that when we're building lesson plans is always analyzing the state standards and benchmarks. What are the things that have to be taught and that are required to be taught, whether it's by the state of Michigan or nationally? So that's the first guiding thing, would be our state standards and benchmarks. So we would analyze the standards and benchmarks, and then we would look to see, well, what are teachers in need of? What are they asking for? Are they asking for more lesson plans specifically designed about how to include this narrative in English and language arts? Is it in social studies, math, or science? So that becomes the first focus of this. And then we design lesson plans that will help to dispel key myths or stereotypes. And again, as we've said before, to get rid of that single story narrative. We want to make sure that when we're putting forward these lesson plans, that it's really going to focus on getting rid of that single-sided story and showing the beauty within the Middle East.
I mean, I really like that, especially the diversity part within the Middle East, because like different people have different views, and I think it's important to have to listen to these, because that's how good debate is made. When you have people not just agreeing with you and just kind of asking questions and probing. And there's been people that I've literally argued with or debated with, and then years later I reflect, because it was a conversation back and forth, and I see where they're coming from, even though maybe not at that time. But for me, I feel like conversation, at least, is like nobody's killing each other. So that's really the best way to go about it. So are there any emerging trends or developments that you find promising in this area?
For sure, when it comes to the curriculum, we're definitely seeing teachers saying we want more information. Students are asking for more things. They want to know more about the Middle East. These are very relevant topics. I mean, teaching about genocide is a key standard that we have for the state of Michigan. So these are things that are going to be mentioned or brought up into classrooms anyhow. And so teachers are looking for support. They want training. They want resources on how they can teach these topics in a very balanced and very fair manner, but also more accurately. And I think for a lot of them, they feel like, oh, I don't want to touch the Middle East because I just don't feel confident. I don't know all of the different ethnic groups. I don't know all of the different religious groups that exist in the Middle East. So when you don't feel confident about the topic, that makes you feel more reserved. And we find that over time, it ends up getting, as you said, swept under the rug. That's not what we want. We want you to be fully prepared to be able to talk about these topics with confidence in front of your students and in the classroom, to have all the resources necessary to be able to make this happen. So when students ask questions, they will feel like that they're coming to a person who knows what they're talking about. And then also the community feels valued. They feel involved in the curriculum and the education. And so that's another key thing that they want to make sure that they are able to have.
I mean, I totally agree with that. So our museum is moving and we're adding a genocide gallery. And before I had a really hard time addressing that again because of past wounds and just in general, it's like this area you don't want to go to. But you know what? I realized like this is the way it helps healing, but it also prevents from these things happening again. And other communities have been able to share those stories more comfortably because it's been going on for well, because they've been sharing it for longer. It's not because it's been going on with us for a long time, but sharing it hasn't been. And I think it's a very healthy thing. And I really appreciate what you do and that you're creating safe havens for people to share their stories as they are. Because again, like what the Prime Minister shared, that the speech that he gave, we were just so impressed. We were just really cheering for him. It was a healing. And I remember I told my colleagues, you know, the people that I was sitting next to, I said, you know, it's such an inspiring speech. Regardless of what's going to happen tomorrow and how much he can implement it or not, his words were authentic and it created some healing. And sometimes just that shift is all you need to get started, because somebody in the audience, he might not do anything, but somebody in the audience might take that and nurture that and go somewhere with it. So it's very important what you guys are doing. Thank you so much. I look forward to meeting you in person because you are local. So there is that. So a lot of my guests are not, but you are local, and I look forward to meeting you in person.
Hopefully, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Eraqi. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.